Yeah, and that is one thing that I really did enjoy about your book is that you do get into some of the seedier elements, some of the more obscure elements of New York gay history. Welcome to another episode of the Gay Barchives Show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is Marc Zinaman, author of Queer Happened Here, which is a retrospective look at about 100 years of New York City's gay bar history. So, welcome, Marc.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm excited about your book, Queer Happened Here 100 Years of New York City's Landmark LGBTQ plus places. Um, it, it's always nice to me to see somebody doing kind of an anthology that includes a spectrum of time and kind of gives you a little different perspective on how things evolved and how the scene developed over the years. I notice on your bookshelf behind you, you've got a few of my other favorite gay books. I see your own. I read up there as well. Um, but it's always nice to see people that do kind of a little digging into history and try to give people a perspective other than just tell stories about when I was 20, I was a hooker in New York, and this is the place where I got luckiest. This is an actual kind of history book that will give people insight into New York. So, how did you get inspired to start this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first off, I'm a native New Yorker, so I was born and raised here. And I think, queer history is not taught. And so how do you learn it? And, I think one impetus was just learning about queer history so much later in life. And, like one place in particular that really stands out is basically I would walk on my way to school every morning by this, elaborate building, but I never paid it any attention. And then, I think I was in my mid 20s when I found out that building housed the Continental Baths, which is one of the most lavish gay bathhouses in history. And, it would have been helpful if I knew that when I was like 15 and a scared little queer kid who didn't know that there were gay people all around me. So it was things like that, just like that, all this gay history is like right in your face, but so hidden and, not well documented. And then I think the impetus for this, how I got to this book was a few years back, I had watched a couple Studio 54 documentaries and I knew about Studio 54, that's been covered a lot, but if they mentioned some other spaces that just sounded out of this world and like I couldn't believe they were real and I had never heard of them. And so I kind of just went to go look them up. One of them was Gigi's Barnum, which was basically this discotheque in the 70s that had like gay men and trans women who were trapeze artists doing acrobatic stuff above a net that hung above the dance floor that just sounded crazy. Another one that stood out to me was Crisco Disco, which was this sort of after hours discotheque that had a giant Crisco can for the DJ booth that people just danced around. So it's places like that, like I'd never heard of, never saw a picture of, and yet they were like on blocks that I walked by all the time. And so then I just started looking up a couple places every day. And then I made a Google map for myself and pinning them. And then the pandemic hit. So then all of a sudden that became this like obsession. And I had, took a step back one day and had like 1,000 places on my map and was like, what do I do with this? And so then I started this Instagram account called Queer Happen Here, which is when I just started sharing all that stuff with people. And, part of that was just to share it with friends and like, see, they didn't know about these places either. And then I think the other thing that happened was just finding all these people who had their own photos, their own stories, their own memories from these places who started commenting on it and sharing stuff with me. And so then it was like, oh, there's a real hunger for this. And so, that account grew and then it got this book, which is just an alternative format for preserving history and maybe, might outlive the Instagram account because who knows, that could get shut down any day. So,
I can totally relate with what you're saying because I started my Gay Archives project just before the pandemic. And it too kind of took on a life of its own. When I first started, it all kind of spawned out of a conversation with the owner of one of Atlanta's most iconic gay bars, which was Backstreet. And
Mm.
Backstreet was there for decades. It was there for just under 30 years in the same location, and was, for the last half of its life, a 24-hour liquor establishment. So
Wow.
they had to have a bartender on duty 24 hours a day, every day of the year. And I started with this conversation and I posted something about it on Facebook, and people started interacting and saying, "Oh yeah, I remember, when I used to go to Backstreet, and before that we would go to, the Armory, which was next door, or we would go to this bar or that bar." And it kind of mushroomed, and now my Facebook group has over 16,000 members, and it never ceases to amaze me. Yesterday, I put a post in there about what I thought was an obscure bar. It was a place called Lizzie Borden's in Erie, Pennsylvania in the 1980s. Among other comments on there, I had two members of our group write paragraphs of history about that bar that they remembered from when they knew the owner and they lived in Erie, and who owned it first and who they sold it to and why, and so there is definitely a need and an interest in this kind of subject. What particularly interested me about your book is that you've gone back, you basically cover a century, but you even go back further than that. Probably the oldest gay bar that I was able to document so far was a bar called Zanzibar in Cannes, France. And that was operational from 1865, I think it was. No, 1885 to 2010. So it was open for 125 years.
Wow.
But around that same time frame, you kind of touch on one bar in New York that was called Pfaff's. It was a steakhouse restaurant on the main floor and had this kind of underground little secret bar for, it wouldn't have been advertised as a gay bar. It would have been, literary folks and theater folks and, kind of
Bohemians, basically.
bohemians. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it also has the distinct honor of claiming to have be the location of where Walt Whitman wrote part of his Leaves of Grass series. And so to me, that's, kind of interesting that they have actually documented even that far back in New York City. But you basically start off in the 20s, and in your book, what was the New York scene like in the 1920s, the New York City scene?
Yeah, I mean the 1920s was interesting because you have sort of the flapper era, the Harlem Renaissance was really big. So I think in New York City specifically, you know, you have a lot of queer things happening in Harlem, which after the kind of 30s goes away for a really long time. So you have spaces like, Jimmy Daniel's nightclub, which was a nightclub owned by a gay black male cabaret singer. Like, so to think that that was in the 30s is just incredible. Or you had, performers like Gladys Bentley, who was this like large and in charge black woman who dressed like a man and like sang these raunchy songs about the women she was into. And so it's just this like incredibly unbelievable scene that you can't even imagine was happening that time. So I think it was, you know, more freely open and queer people, even though they, it was illegal and they were able to kind of find ways to be more out there and express themselves. And, you have places like Webster Hall and Hamilton Lodge Ball that I mentioned in the book, where basically people are going to these very lavish balls and dressing in the opposite gender, whether they're straight or not, like to sort of play with gender. And it was much more playful back then. So I think it was a fun time for a while.
Yeah. And then, of course, we had prohibition come in, and a lot of things went underground, which in some ways, I guess, was good for the gay world, because most of the gay bars, even up to the 50s and 60s, were kind of underground to begin with. They didn't try to be on the main street with a huge rainbow flag outside. Of course, that didn't exist, but
Yeah.
they were operating under the radar for the most part. Um, and then after prohibition was over, you start to see a little bit more activity in the gay scene. you mentioned in the 1940s, one of the ones in the 40s and 50s chapter, one of the bars that you talk about was Club 82. And that's another one that has kind of an interesting history and is still fairly, relatively speaking, well known to people who are interested in New York City gay culture. What did you discover about Club 82 um, in the
Yeah,
recent?
Club 82, yeah, it's part of this kind of lineage of these female and male impersonator spaces. They were kind of like supper clubs also. So that kind of had this whole culture of slumming, which was basically, straight people coming down to these bars to sort of be entertained by queer people, kind of for humor. But it also was a space where basically gay men, lesbian, people who we would maybe now identify as trans or non-binary, were able to be employed and find jobs and explore gender and, build communities. And, I think the thing about Club 82 and Club 81, which was its predecessor, they were also mafia run. And so that gets really interesting because we have this long history of, LGBTQ spaces primarily existing because the mafia was involved. The mafia was protecting the gay community, but also using them in a way and profiting off of them. But so it's a really like push-pull of like we wouldn't have had these spaces without the mafia, but were they looking out for our best interests? So, it's complicated, but thankfully they were there to begin with. So I think Club 82 also is one of the spaces, one thing I really love and highlight a few times in this book is when a venue changes hands over many eras and becomes different gay spaces, maybe on purpose, maybe unknowingly. And so, there's places like that, or I think, not to jump ahead, but like Lucky Chang's, which was, in the 90s, an Asian drag and trans-led restaurant. But before that, it was the Club Baths, which was a gay-owned bathhouse. And in between then, it was sort of this like ancient Rome themed restaurant where hip lesbians hung out. So spaces that get kind of passed on through queer generations. And I always think that's really cool and very New York.
Yeah, and I've seen it in some other cities as well, but I'm doing projects obviously with different neighborhoods and different cities around the country, and I one current project involves the gay history of Wilton Manors, which
Mm,
isn't very long. It only goes back to the early 80s, but there are physical street addresses there that have housed 7 or 8 different gay bars in the last 40 years in the same exact space. And it just changes one after the other. And I think part of that is just habit, because if the gay community is going to, you know, number 91 7th Avenue South, they're going to keep going there accidentally, and they just go to the new bar. Um, so it doesn't totally surprise me, but I have seen it in a number of cities. And another reason I think might be part of the reason that's happening is you also have landlords, because most of these bars, especially when you go back before the 90s, most of the gay bars were tenants, not landowners.
mm,
So if you had a landlord who was accepting of renting to a gay bar space, it's only natural that the next gay bar owner is going to look to them and say, "Hey, can I rent your space now?" Whereas other people might say, "We don't want no queers here, go away."
right.
So I think that probably played a part in it too.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And you're right, excuse me, the mafia. The mafia did own quite a number of gay bars in New York City and several other cities. And I think part of that is because after Prohibition ended, where they were running so many of the speakeasies, they lost a cash cow. They lost
Yes.
a secret market that they could dominate and make tons of money on. And they looked for another secret market, which happened to be gay bars. And many of
Precisely.
them at that time were operated by members of the mafia, allegedly.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, moving past the 40s and 50s, as we enter the 60s, we're seeing a lot of change in American culture to begin with. You're seeing um, a new vibe, in family life and community life. it's things are changing across the country, and you're also seeing things like the women's right movement. You're seeing the hippie free love kind of vibe. You're seeing things like Woodstock. People are changing their mindset about what is and isn't appropriate behavior, and you're kind of loosening up. The country's getting a little bit more liberal, and in that time, uh, we would be remiss to not mention two of the bars in New York City that played huge roles in the gay environment back then. And one of them, you mentioned both of them in your book, but one of them is still operating today. It's the club called Julius. Uh, Julius operated since, I think, the late 19th century as a bar of some sort, but it really got its um, name known to the gay community when they had a sip-in at at Julius, protesting the fact that it was illegal for gay people to drink in a bar or to serve gay people in a bar. And so they kind of did this mini protest. I think was it the Mattachine Society that organized that?
Yeah, yes, there were a few people. I think there were three or four of them, yes.
So
But
when you looked into the Julius situation, which was in what, 66, I think,
yes,
um, did they have any reputation at all of serving gay clientele prior to 66 that you know of?
Julius's, yes, they did. The funny story with the sip-in is that Julius's was technically not the plan. I believe the three or four members, they initially tried to go to a different venue that they knew kind of were resistant to serving gay people, and then that day that place happened to be closed. And then I think they went to a second venue and had a similar experience. So Julius sort of was this very accidental, like, oh shoot, we didn't plan this so well, so let's go to this place. And I believe Julius, the reason it worked was Julius had actually just been sort of rated for some other gay issue. And so they had this sign in the window that this is like a rated premises. So, as soon as they mentioned that they were gay to the bartender, he knew like this bar is already being watched. And so that's why he refused them. So it is this very like accidental moment in history that I think has really helped Julius become legendary and might be contributing to why it's still around today. But it's great that it's still around today.
Yeah, it is. And I've spoken to the owner, Helen Buford is her
Yes.
name.
Yes, I interviewed her. Yes.
And she insists that the bar was gay friendly prior to the sip in. And that, she tells a similar story to what you tell, that it was a matter of circumstance and timing. And that that's why, they were refused service at that particular moment in time. But Helen and her husband also owned several other known gay bars in New York City, including one called Two Potato. Uh, so they had a history of being involved in the gay bar business. Obviously, neither of them are gay, but they've maintained the bar. Julius, it still operates today. It's still very popular, and most people know it as the longest continuously operating gay bar in Manhattan. Uh,
Yes.
Now, the other one that has some kind of a strange and mythical history almost is a name that everybody knows, and
Mhm.
that is the Stonewall Inn. I want to kind of set the stage a little bit for people who may not know. Prior to being recognized as a gay bar, which I think happened in like 1967, is when they first started targeting the gay market. But it was a place called Bonnie's Stonewall Inn, which had nothing to do with, a gay bar at all. It was obviously located in the same place. I think they might have had rooms for rent in an adjacent building or something, but it was called Bonnie's Stonewall Inn. And then when it was taken over in '67, it was named the Stonewall Inn. And it's worth mentioning, as we've already kind of touched on, it was allegedly mafia operated, very well documented, in fact. that there was a mafia operation going on there. But also, another thing that a lot of people may not know is they were completely illegal. They did not have a liquor license. They never existed in reality as a legitimate bar in New
Right.
York City. Um, so I wanted to clarify that. And the second thing, and that a lot of people don't realize, is it was only open for about 2 years. So it opened in '67, and a few months after the Stonewall Uprising, it was gone for, well, I'd like to say forever. It wasn't gone forever.
For a
It
long
became
time, for like
for
30
20
years or
years.
yeah,
Yeah,
20
and then
years.
so what did you discover about the Stonewall uprisings that kind of challenged the myths of what everybody says about Stonewall?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I included Stonewall because I felt like, you can't leave it out from a kind of anthology like this. But I think my perspective or approach with Stonewall was one, you know, to provide some of the insights that you just mentioned about that maybe people don't know or don't know because they're just keep reading the same facts that get spit out time and time again. And so, yeah, making people aware that actually the Stonewall Inn right after the uprising basically closed and was gone for like a long time. And what we have today was revitalized by other people who wanted to bring it back. And so I think a lot of people go there now and are just like, this is the same exact space that it was in 1969, but it's not true. So, I wanted to highlight just the cold hard facts that we do know. And yeah, I mean, I think there are many books that talk about Stonewall. There are many interviews done by other people about the uprising. I interviewed and have spoken with many people about the uprising, and everyone has their own version of the story, and everyone's version of the story disagrees with the other person's version of the story. And so, yeah, it's this sort of like mythic lore about what really happened. And I sort of wanted to veer away from that because as soon as you say that, you get, no, that's wrong because I was there. And so I think that that's also an interesting part of just documenting queer nightlife history is that like when you go to a nightlife space, you're drinking or maybe there's drugs, like your memory may not be the best. And so everyone has their own version of what happened that night. And I think that's totally fair. But there are some cold hard facts, and that was kind of my approach to documenting Stonewall of just like, here's the physical history of the space. Here are the names of the people who don't get highlighted enough, who brought it back and like worked really hard and made no money off bringing it back. So that was an important part.
Yeah, and I've interviewed several people about it as well. Um, the first one that comes to mind is Marc Siegel, who was there on the night of the riot. And he tells me in his interview, point blank, there were no bricks thrown.
Hmm.
So, myth number one, uh, Sylvia and Marcia did not throw bricks. In fact, they were not even there when the riot broke out. They arrived later. Um, so, which is not to discount their importance in the struggle for gay rights and for the freedoms that we have now, but it's just setting one fact straight. To me, in a lot of ways, Stonewall has kind of become the Columbus discovered America story of the gay world.
Yeah.
Columbus never set foot in North America, but yet everybody seems to think he did. And even cities and places like Ohio are named after him for some unknown reason. But Um, in fact, New York has an avenue named after him.
Yes, we
Um,
do.
but and I live in Tampa. I have a street half a block from me named after him. But so that was one of the things that was a little bit twisted in what everybody seems to think they know about Stonewall. The bar, the space itself, after 1969, became a succession of things, including a Chinese restaurant and a bagel shop and
Yep.
whatever. And I think the person that you were, or people you were alluding to, um, who kind of helped resurrect the memory and preserve it to what it is today, was when Jimmy Paisano came in. And
Yes.
the funny thing, I interviewed Bob Gurecki, who
Yes, I
worked,
also spoke with him.
yeah, and we talked about what was originally called, when he opened it in 89 or 90, he originally called it New Jimmy's at Stonewall Place. And Bob says that Jimmy always insisted that New Jimmy's was um, in the memory of Jimmy Merry, who had the Ice Palace and other bars that were
Mm,
well known in New York, the Red Parrot. And it was not, him trying to be grand and putting his own name on the bar. But people disagree about that too. Some people say he was kind of egotistical and that's what he wanted. But in
mm,
any event, it was open as New Jimmy's. And then the following year, they decided just to change it back to Stonewall. So
right,
what we know today as the Stonewall um, really only exists since 1990. And from what Bob told me in his interview, when they moved in to open up New Jimmy's, there was virtually nothing of historical value in the building. So anything you see there that you think, oh, this is the bar that Marsha Johnson stood next to, it ain't.
right,
Uh, but and it's only half of the space of the Stonewall back in 1969.
right.
The other half is now the visitor center or whatever it is, the museum.
Yes, the museum, right.
Um, but in any event, it did play a big role because it was a place that you could serve, that did serve alcohol illegally, um, and that you could dance with a partner of the same gender, which was
Yes.
something that was very unusual in New York City bars at that time. So it did play a huge role, and the week long uprisings that happened as a result of it, and all of the organizations that grew out of it, certainly have made an impact on our history. Um, and so, of course, we're glad now that the Stonewall is operating again, and that they are taking some responsibility for preserving that history with the museum next door.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely great that it's, in our hands still and that we have it and that it's a wonderful place and is memorializing the history. But yes, the history is a very wild, wild situation, It's in
Yeah,
everyone's hands and that's okay. I mean, it's fine, but it's nice to also just remember that there are some facts.
and it's also when you're dealing with a marginalized society, the history is even more erratic because it's not documented in mainstream media. There weren't
Right,
TV shows and movies and newspapers and magazine coverage of what was going on a daily basis.
right.
Obviously the Stonewall Uprising was covered in the papers and on some of the media, but for the most part, the history is not recorded well as it would have been had that been some other, mainstream venue.
Yeah.
Now, you touched on another bar that kind of came after Stonewall that was of particular interest to you, and that was the Crisco Disco.
Mhm.
I'm surprised that name has not been revived. I don't know if there's a reason, but as you mentioned, they reconstructed a gigantic, I think it was like 7 or 8 foot tall Crisco can in the corner of the dance area, um, and made that into the DJ booth. So the DJ was standing basically inside a Crisco can, um,
Yes.
and of
Which
course,
sounds so insane. Like, who came up with that? Right. That was one of the first places that I was like, I have to put this in the book. I've never seen anyone talk about it or document it. Like, and there was this one incredible picture that I had seen of it, and I was like, I've got to get it no matter what. And that was by Bill Bernstein. And then I found, a few others, but like, yeah, it's just things like that where I'm like, why is no one talking about it? It's so out of this world and wild.
I agree. And, it's worth mentioning at this point that we're now talking about the 70s and we're going to move into the 80s. The 70s and the 80s, particularly in New York City, were a dynamic time for innovation in the gay bar scene. Um, there are bars that operated there during those decades and even into the 90s that have made an indelible mark on gay bar history. You mentioned, Crisco Disco, but in the same general time frame, we also have Studio 54, we have Paradise Garage, we have the Saint, we have the Limelight. Those all are iconic places that will probably never be recreated in their original format. Studio 54, which everybody knows about, was not technically a gay bar. It was an everybody who's really cool bar,
Yes.
but it was mind blowing. The story that I've heard, and I don't know if you've heard this or if it's, but the story that I heard, I interviewed two guys about the movie that came out called Studio One Forever, which was the Los Angeles gay club in the 70s through the 90s. And Studio One Forever, they claim that Steve Rubell came to LA, saw that club, was blown away, and Studio One was 100% gay, and almost to the exclusion of women in the
Hmm.
bar. I mean, they were unabashedly gay. But Steve Rubell allegedly went there, saw the place, and said, "This is what I want to do," and opened Studio 54 in New York. Have you heard anything to that extent, or?
I don't know if I've heard about it from Studio One, but I definitely think Studio 54 came about as, an updated vision of experiencing other spaces. Like I think he had also already gone to like some of the other gay bars in New York too, like Flamingo or 12 West, and saw how, invigorating they were and was like, let me do it better. So yeah, I don't think he just like was sitting at home one day and came up with it. I think he pulled inspiration from many spaces.
Yeah. And they did a great job with it. And it, like I said, it's indelibly etched in our memories, even though, much like Stonewall, it only lasted less than 3 years. I think it was 30 months um,
Yeah.
that Studio
Yes.
54, in its original incarnation, existed.
Right.
But it made a huge impact. Um, and then you also had in New York City in the 80s, you had Paradise Garage. That's another epic club that blew the world away with their amazing sound and light system. People still talk about it. I mentioned to you earlier a friend of mine in the Dominican Republic who opened a gay bar there and named it Paradise Garage for the reason that Paradise Garage had such a powerful memory for him. What did you learn about Paradise Garage that was a little surprising to you?
Yeah, I mean, among many of the spaces in the book, like that's one I wish I could have been at. I think, one thing worth mentioning is that they have a reunion party every year, which I go to and is where I got this shirt actually. It's one of my favorite events every year. It's basically this wonderful mixture of, younger queer people mingling on the dance floor with some of the original Paradise Garage folk who, some of them are coming to this party with their walkers, their canes. I remember one year I witnessed an older woman take off her prosthetic leg and just like raise it to the roof to the music. So it's this beautiful space of just like the history. And, you can be on the dance floor and someone older will come up to you and just start telling you about how great Paradise Garage was. So I really love that party. But yeah, I mean, I think, people talk about Paradise Garage and the first thing that rolls off their tongue is it's DJ Larry Levan, who really just like influenced music in a way that I can't even imagine. He would play things at the club and then it would be on the radio across the country, the next day. So he had a really like strong hold on just the music industry. So I think that's really fascinating to have, a singular nightclub and a singular DJ leave such an impact on just the world at large and how it was listening to music.
Right. And much like Studio 54, Paradise Garage was not exclusively gay. Um,
Right.
but it made a huge impact. And what you're starting to see at this particular time frame, which I think also is worthy of pointing out, is that prior to the 1970s, most of the gay establishments that we had, other than bathhouses, some of which were quite extensive, but most of the gay bars were small. They were dark, dimly lit, off the beaten path, enter through the back door, you know, very discreet, underground kind of things. Once you started to get into this, into the 70s and 80s, and you started having bars like Crisco Disco and Paradise and Saint and Studio 54 and Limelight, suddenly you're thrust into this environment that is a mega club. I mean, it's huge. It has a ridiculous amount of money spent on sound and lighting. It has top notch talent coming in. And for the first time, probably, um, a lot of gay people felt like they had a place that was made them feel worthy. I know my first gay bar experience was in the 70s. And when I first went to the first couple of gay bars, I felt a little bit like second class because you'd see these nice straight bars, and then you'd go to a gay bar in some town, and it'd be like a little hole in the wall and
Hmm.
whatever. So the disco era and the big dance club era kind of changed that because now we started to see, in addition to the kind of liberalization of American thinking, you're also seeing straight people interacting with gay people in an environment that they are both absolutely ecstatic to be in. And I think
Right.
that was a big turning point in how the gay community started to evolve, was whether or not you liked the fact that it was a bar or that it was, dance music or whatever. It had a very big impact on where we came to.
100%. I mean, I think as nice as it is to just be on a dance floor where everyone is gay, I think there's also something really nice about just being able to be on any dance floor and have straight people come up to you and be like ready to dance with you too. So I think that really was important. And like places like Paradise Garage, they weren't exclusively gay, but I think Friday nights was supposed to be straight night and Saturday nights was supposed to be gay night or the other way around. And then they just ended up being mixed both because it was so popular and people were just comfortable doing that. So yes, it was a really like radical change.
Now, what one of my favorite New York clubs, which of course you also mentioned, you mentioned so many of my favorites in there, but this one in particular, because not only was it just impressive. I mean, the space itself would blow you away. But the fact that it was also, for all intents and purposes, exclusively gay, exclusively male, and a membership club, and yet it managed to just blow the doors off everything. And that was the Saint. I mean,
Yeah.
how would
Another
you
one I wish I could have gone to.
how would you describe that to somebody if they said, what am I missing by never going? I know you didn't go there, but you've done enough research. What do you think you would say if somebody said, "Hey, what was so special about the Saint? Why was the Saint a big deal?"
Yeah, I mean there are so many I think this ain't really changed gay nightlife forever, of course. There are so many elements I think that go into that. I think, first of all, it was spearheaded and funded by a gay man. It was his. So it wasn't, mafia run. It wasn't a straight couple running it. And, a lot of money was put into it. And it was, this incredibly innovative architecture and interior design to just create this out of this world club experience with this light show and this star, galaxy that, just would show up above you while you're dancing. And then, yeah, I think the elements of the membership is a very fascinating aspect because it sort of curated who got to go and what kind of connections were being made to get you in there. And so yeah, it's all those things coming together. And then it was huge and it had all the hottest DJs at the time, so it just became this mecca for like gay nightlife and everyone planned their whole lives around going there. I think from all the people I've spoken to, it was just part of the schedule all of a sudden.
Yeah,
So yeah,
I interviewed Robbie Leslie, who's a friend of mine. He lives down here in Florida as well, And I interviewed him, and we talked about the Saint and 54 and numerous other bars as well. And it's an experience that you just can't imagine. It's like going into this gigantic planetarium, that same
Right.
kind of experience you have, in eighth grade, and they're showing the whole celestial sky above you moving around, and you're just in awe. But then you realize you're in a nightclub with 100-foot tall tower or whatever, with hundreds of lights and speakers on it, and, and you're just immersed in this sea of gay joy. It's almost impossible to describe what it would be like today, because we don't have anything like that I'm aware
Right.
of.
Yeah. No, I mean that's exactly it. Like to imagine that eighth grade, you know, constellation system, but then you're also listening to incredible disco music surrounded by very handsome men who are probably not fully clothed. And then, perhaps there are, certain things in your system or in other people's systems around you that are elevating the experience. It's really hard to picture or imagine
Yeah, it's
without.
it's an amazing time. And of course, around the same time we had Limelight, which we, all know was, again, not exclusively gay, but did play an important role and did have gay events and gay nights, and Peter Gatien, of course, operated the Tunnel and a number of other clubs around New York that were very well known and very popular with gays on different nights. Um, and of course, out of that story comes the Michael Ehrlich story, which we'd rather forget, but
Right.
we don't have that option. But that was another one that contributed greatly, and it was another groundbreaking concept to take this gigantic, I believe it was it Methodist Church, a gigantic church, and convert it into an incredible nightclub.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of this beginning of like these incredible cavernous, unique spaces that can support themselves by being nightclubs that didn't exist before. So
But
yeah, I would have loved to have like gone there also and be like in this Gothic church and just having the time of my life.
but at the same time as all this is happening, um, there's another club in New York that's very well known, kind of almost as an underground, um, off the beaten path kind of thing, the Pyramid Club, which was like diametrically opposed to what you would see at any of these giant bars. You go to Paradise or the Saint or Limelight or 54, everybody's dressed to the nines. They're all fancy schmancy people. And then you go over to the Pyramid, and it's like the opposite end of the spectrum. There's a lot of drag queens, there's trans people there. It's, very low key, kind of punk, goth, um, non conventional gay. And that had a huge, long history as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of starts to speak to just the, LGBTQ plus community at large. Like as incredible as the Saint was and its membership was, it was also a very white, cisgender, gay male space. And so like then you start to think about who's left out. And I think that's where places like the Pyramid come in, where all these, creative, alternative people, are also looking for spaces to find and build community. And so you have these incredible, drag queens and performance artists and, just creating their own environment and also innovating and building a new kind of space that didn't exist before. And so yeah, the Pyramid, also lasted a really long time and really sort of revolutionized drag and performance art and downtown art scene. So I think it's nice to have different types of spaces coexisting at the same time, catering to different components of the community.
Yeah, and I'm particularly grateful to Linda Clifford. I'm sorry, Linda Simpson, for
Yes.
recording. For having the audacity to walk into a club, especially an underground kind of grungy gay club, at that time frame with a camera, because
Yes.
that's something that is sorely lacking in a lot of our history, is documentation photographically. And Linda Simpson did an excellent job. She has a beautiful book out that's got a lot of her pictures from the scene back then. And with people like her who not only experienced it but documented it, that's an important element of recording our history too.
100%. Just did an event with her last night. I love her. Yeah, and I think her being very much in the scene and then also being the photographer creates a really unique vantage point because she's not an observer, she's photographing her friends. And so like that creates this different level of intimacy.
Yeah, and she
Um,
also published a magazine of sorts at that
yes,
time that was documenting the scene too. So she wasn't just taking photographs and then 40 years later trying to remember what happened. She
right.
actually had written documents and all kinds of stuff going on there. So she was really, an important part of documenting that aspect of the history and the story of Weekstock
Yes.
and things, things that were an important element in how the culture evolved. Now, as we move into the 90s, we start to see some other clubs as well in New York that some of them have some bearing on the 70s and 80s. They, similar reflection. The one that comes to mind, I spoke to Steve Lewis about it quite a bit, was Palladium, another club that you just cannot imagine walking into a dance floor and at the end of the dance floor having a 100-foot tall Keith Haring mural going up to the ceiling, 100 feet tall. Wouldn't have even been in a bar that had 100-foot high ceilings, let alone a Keith Haring mural.
That's right.
Um, and the plethora of video monitors they had around there in a time when video was not the thing; it was just kind of coming into being.
Right.
Um, so that was an incredible space. Roxy, my roommate's favorite bar ever in New York was Roxy,
Mm.
and I don't think he ever went there to roller skate, but but he loved that bar and talks about it all the time. And it was in an old roller rink, right? Isn't that how?
Yes. Yes, I think it was a roller rink at first in the late 70s, and then it closed and changed hands and was named a few other clubs, and then it reopened in 1990 by, I think, Gene Danino. And then, yeah, I think that the funny thing is when it was existing through the 90s, it sort of started to host, I don't know if it was once a month, but these kind of roller skating gay parties that were an homage to the original Roxy.
Yeah. And John Blair was involved with doing the promotions there for quite a while. Um,
Yes.
so it certainly was on the radar. But then again, you're still seeing on the flip side, you're seeing some other bars that have more targeted and quite different audiences. Um, I interviewed DJ Relentless, who had worked at one time at Escolita. And Escolita is like polar opposite to these, white boy country club gay bars. So what did you learn about Escolita in the course of your research?
Yeah, I mean, Escalade is fascinating. I mean, and I think it sort of speaks to my like desire to try to document all different kinds of spaces that were catering to different subsets of the community and not just, the giant cis gay white male mega clubs. So yeah, Escalita, I think it was originally started in the basement of a school, which is how it got its name on the Upper West Side, and then, got shut down a whole bunch of times and kept moving around. And then eventually it landed on, its kind of final location and was, very much for, and for and by the Latin community specifically, and really catered to kind of this old school drag scene and was very like persistent in keeping that going, even though, drag at places like Pyramid was very much like, now I'm hairy and have a beard and I'm doing crazy thing. Like this was like, old school drag at its finest. And, it really stuck around for a long time. And I think a lot of people speak really fondly about it.
Yeah, and that is one thing that I really did enjoy about your book is that you do get into some of the seedier elements, some of the more obscure elements of New York gay history, because so many people will focus on, what the easy pickings, as I call them, the stuff that everybody knows about and talks about. And if you picked up any copy of HX or whatever the magazine of the month was there, you would find ads for them everywhere. You just say, oh, yeah, everybody knows about Splash. Everybody knows about this bar or that bar. And to me, it's always more interesting when I find the ones that are kind of obscure, and
Same.
that deal with a very niche market or have a unique history, that maybe doesn't get told as often as you'd like it to be told. So, to that end, another one that you mentioned in there, which is another splintered group of the gay community, you talk about lure. And lure, I've had various people tell me different stories about it, but basically to me, it sounds like it was somewhere between um, an eagle and a bathhouse. That's the impression I get from the people who have told me stories about lore. What did you discover about lore?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this, like, and in many other cities too, there's this long lineage of these sort of gay leather scene, the fetish scene, BDSM scene. And so Lure was one of the later ones to come, I think. But that one, and I mean, its name even sort of speaks to its interests. I think Lure stands for leather, rubber, uniform, etc., which is a great, if you know acronym, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I think they really became known for some of their like crazy fetish themed parties and attracted a very specific kind of crowd. And that's another, subset of the community that is important and needs to be documented. And there were many spaces that came before it, like the Mine Shaft and Anvil, and there were all these leather bars in the Meatpacking District. So that was just one of many that I wanted to document, and I think I got a few in there. I couldn't get them all, but yeah, I mean, people tell me crazy lore stories. So
Yeah. I had a friend who wrote a book, two books actually, that document the gay bar history, and one was for Chicago and one was for South Florida. And he just does it like almost an encyclopedic listing of a very brief description of the bars. And in Chicago alone, in the same time frame that you're talking about, the last 100 years, he documented over 1,000 gay spaces in Chicago. So you can only imagine how
right.
long your book would be if you had to dedicate a page or two to every single gay bar that ever existed in New York City. This would be like, the Encyclopedia Britannica. It would not be a single volume book.
100%. Yeah. I mean, that's where my Instagram account comes in. I think I've covered thousands of space, at least 1,000, if not more spaces there. I've got a whole folder on my computer of spaces I still have to cover. So a big challenge in this book was narrowing it down because a book has physical
Oh,
constraints.
absolutely.
So
I
it's,
can I can relate.
with
Well,
every
as
place
you
that I included, I had to exclude 100 places, so it was tough.
Well, as you move forward, I invite you to use the Gay Barchives group, post a picture of a bar logo or a photograph of the bar or whatever, and ask people to contribute their questions. People love to tell stories about the bars that they remember and, the experiences they had there. I interviewed Mike Balaban a while back, and he talks about the mine shaft in particular, where there was a bathtub in the middle of the bar that was there specifically for the purpose of water sports in the bar.
Yes, I've heard about
Um,
it.
so, so yeah, we have a very diverse history there. Now, when you move forward into the 2000s, um, you talk about a couple of bars that also kind of hit different elements of the community. One of them is Mr. Black. And I'd heard about Mr. Black from, again, no, it was Frankie Sharp who told me about that story. And I've spoken to Mr. Black, who is still alive and well and living in Los Angeles, I think,
Yes, I
somewhere.
think I just saw he did a Mr. Black reunion party in
Yeah,
Los Angeles. Yeah.
yeah. And I'll be interviewing him soon about his
Okay,
Mr. Black
great,
history. But,
great.
you have that situation there. You mentioned West Gay at the Westway, which was another Frankie Sharp thing that was just kind of an off the wall gay, repetitive gay party. It wasn't really a bar. Um, and then you talk about Henrietta Hudson, which is one of the most iconic lesbian bars. I think now they've kind of rebranded, as so many bars have, to be an LGBTQ plus everybody's welcome bar, but it still has its roots in the lesbian community in New York.
I believe
And
it has an amazing tagline now that it goes by, which is a queer bar built by dykes. So I love that.
yeah, and that's, that's kind of interesting. You bring up that word and you use it in your title in the book, Queer Happened Here. But
Yeah.
then you also mentioned LGBTQ. In my group, I usually use gay, but I do mix in queer and LGBTQ in my descriptions and posts. How difficult was it to decide on the title and the subtitle? Because I posted, I don't know if you saw it the other day, I posted a poll asking people what their preferred acronym or name for our community is. And it got a pretty good response. I've gotten hundreds of responses to the poll. And according to statistical analysis, it's got about a 6% margin of error. But the number one answer I got was gay. 61% said gay. 20% said LGBTQ, 12% said queer, and then a few other people had random options. How did you decide on the terminology to use for this book?
Yeah, that's a good and very complicated question, I think. I mean, I think part of it is, I'm making this Instagram account and making this book now. And I think now, you know, I hope, and I'm sure there are many people who don't feel this way, but most people are, trying to be really welcoming and inclusive in our community. And what are the terms that are being talked about that can include everyone? Because maybe a trans person doesn't identify with the term gay. So, I think I also know that in the book I have to use these terms all the time, and so to like shuffle through them a million times and pick different ones. So sort of queer and LGBTQ plus feel like they're contemporary umbrella terms, but I also know that they are ahistoric, and there are people who may take offense to the word queer because it's been used as a slur before. But there are many words I think that our community have been offended by, but have reclaimed. Like I just mentioned, queer bar built by dykes, people used to be called dykes as an offensive term. And so like that's part of our history and our community's history is like terminology, and we all disagree on it, and there's no right term and wrong term, and everyone should be free to use their term. But for me, I was just trying to use the contemporary lingo that feels most welcoming and inclusive to everyone. And, queer didn't exist when I came out. I was gay. So like things change quickly, and queer might be obsolete in 5 years. Who knows? I
Yeah,
think
I
that's just
agree with
part of
you.
our
I'm the
history.
same. I'm the same way. I use gay because historically that's how the community was identified. Going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was the gay community. It was gay pride. It wasn't LGBTQ plus pride. Um, so
Sure,
that's the
but then
reason.
even before we had the like gay rights movement, it was the homophile movement. Like no one
Yeah,
calls themselves the homophile. So it's like terms can change quickly.
but I also use other terms interchangeably in my descriptions and my hashtags because I know everybody doesn't use the same term. And I like the way on the cover of your book, the word queer kind of jumps out because it's almost in the middle of the cover in big bold letters. But it also right above that, above the R in queer, it says LGBTQ. So it kind of softens the blow. So anybody who wants to be a radical and say, hey, you're scaring me with the word queer, you've kind of softened it and said, hey, this is the way it is. Um, but I think you've done a fabulous job of looking at all these different places. I know you talked about one of my old favorite New York City bars that I obviously never went to back in the day was, I guess, in the Village, was called the Slide again back at the end of the 19th century. And it was known for, you know, pansy boys going there trying to pick up older men, and it was basically a trick bar. But
Yes.
you mentioned that in your book. You mentioned the not so popular, not the not prom queen, um, and then you mentioned the ones like we've talked about, Stonewall and Paradise Garage and the Saint and so on, that really had, are well known and really had a big impact as well. So I think it's a really great book, and I love the way it looks. And one of my favorite things about it is the fact that you use purple inside them. I
Yeah,
don't know if
thank
it's,
you.
I love purple, um, both on the cover and inside the book. Um, but I am so glad that you put this book out. Is it available right now? Can people order it today?
It's available for ordering. I believe it officially gets released April 29th, which is when, if you order it online, it starts to ship out. So it'll be out at the end of the month and then in stores everywhere after that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for writing this book and for doing the research to go into it. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us about it. I really appreciate you being here.
Of course, thank you for having me. I've wanted to do this for so long and I, love gay Barchives and thank you for doing that. It's a great resource.
Thank you. It's been a labor of love.
Yes,
As
I
you
mean
know,
just
because
as I know. Yes.
none of us get rich doing gay history.
No, no, we do not.
All right, then. Well, thank you. I look forward to our next conversation and to your next book.
Me too. Thank you so much.